Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you all for attending today's legal holiday shir. And the title of the shir is Translated Torah. Now, this is actually going to be more of a continuation or elaboration of what we spoke about between Mincha and Ma'ariv on Tuesday on Asar B'Tevis. And the discussion, there's a big discussion amongst the, in halacha, about, believe it or not, about translating Torah. Something that is so much of a given that we have nowadays, that we've had for a number of years already, really has a very big discussion in it in halacha. There are actually those who actually say one should not do that. It is not appropriate to translate Torah. So it's a very big discussion. We'll touch on a couple of parts, but the whole discussion begins with, again, something we mentioned on Tuesday, which I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on, and that is the story of what we call the Targum Shivim, the Greek translation of the Torah by the 70 sages, which is called in the Septuagint. And the Gemara in this, actually, the story appears in a number of different places. And the Gemara in Megillah Daf Tes Amud Aleph 9a brings down the story like this: Ma'aseh b'Talmai Melech. The story took place by King Talmai. Talmai was the Egyptian ruler of after Alexander the Great had passed away. Talmai, or Ptolemy, I think is pronounced in other places, was one of his generals. When Alexander the Great died, his kingdom was divided up amongst the generals, and Talmai was the king in Egypt, which also, for a time, controlled Eretz Yisrael. So Ma'aseh b'Talmai HaMelech Shekina Shivim U'Shnayim Zakenim. He gathered together 72 elders. V'chnisan b'Shivim U'Shnayim Batim. He put them in 72 houses, or 72 rooms, 72 completely separate rooms. V'Legilu lahem al ma kinsan. He ordered them to come, put them in the rooms, didn't tell them why. V'nichnas eitz l'kol echad ve'echad. And he, the king himself, went to each one, V'amar lahem kisvu li Torahs Moshe Rabchem. Write for me, or translate for me, the Torah of Moshe, your master. Okay? Now, so none of them know what the other one is being told to do. They have no idea. I mean, I would assume they knew they were all gathered, but at the end of the day, nobody knows what each one is doing in their own private room. And Natan HaKadosh Baruch b'leiv kol echad ve'echad eitzah. The Rebbeinu Shalom put in the heart, an idea in the heart of each one of them. V'skimu kol nadas achas, and they all at the end came out giving the same translation. V'kasvulai, and they wrote for him, meaning the point is we're going to see there were certain changes or emendations that they made. So, for instance, the most famous one is, how does the Torah begin? Bereshis bara Elokim, which we translated in the beginning, God created. In Hebrew, the verb comes before the noun. And they translated it as Elokim ba Bereshis. God created in the middle, in the beginning. Because if they wouldn't have translated that way, they were concerned that Talmai might think there's something called Bereshis, that in the beginning, that created God. And therefore they changed that. The next change brought down is Asa Adam B'Tzalmai U'B'Demus. Right before a man was created, God says, the Torah says, Na'asa Adam B'Tzalmeinu Kidmusenu. Let us make man in our form and in our image. Rashi says that he was calling together the angels. But the concern was, when translating the Torah, don't forget, this translation was a translation. It was not a commentary. It was a translation. And therefore, were they to translate those words as is, Talmai might get the wrong idea that there's more than one God creating man. And therefore, they changed it to Esa Adam B'Tselem Admus. I will make man in a form. Then there's a couple of other ones. There is, for instance, in this week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha, when Yaakov, by the blessings of Yaakov, when he rebukes Shimon and Levi, so it says there, Ki ba'apam hargu. It says Ki ba'apam hargu ish. With their anger, they killed a man. Uvertzainam ikru shar, and with their desire, they uprooted the horse. Okay, so if you're right that to argue they killed a man, Talmai's not going to take that too well. He's going to say, look, your ancestors went ahead and killed their brother. Therefore, they changed it in the following. Ki be'apim hargu shar, in their anger they killed an ox. Uvertzainam, and in their desire, utru avus, they uprooted the water, the feeding trough. Complete different change, completely different words. Okay, you've got another one. In Parsha Shmos, Vayikach Moshe Ishtei Vaspanav, Varikiveim, Moshe took his wife and sons and rode them on a donkey. No, they didn't ride donkey. They rode Al Neisei B'nei Adam, on what carries people. Because, as Rashi says, Talmai is going to say, Moshe didn't have a horse or a camel? He only had a donkey? And therefore they said, they didn't take out the word donkey, and they gave it a word that could imply a horse, it could imply a camel. Okay. We know that in Parshas Bay, it says, Moshe B'nai Yisrael, Asher Yashvu Mitzrayim, the amount of the Jewish people dwelled in Mitzrayim, how many years?
410.
That's what the Torah says.
No, 400.
400 years, right? And because it says 400 years, there's lots of questions that the commentators have to deal with. How do you count 400 years? So therefore, you know what they did? They wrote like this. U'Moshe b'nei Yisrael sheyashvu b'Mitzrayim u'b'shar aratzos. The amount of time that they lived in Mitzrayim and other lands, including in Canaan, Arba Meir Shana, 400 years. Okay? That's their change. Okay? And then there is another one. Moshe Rabbeinu, in the story of Korach, when he tries to say, he says, Lo chamor echa nasasi mehem. I didn't even take a donkey from them. Again, they take the word donkey, and they use the word chemed. Chemed means, I have not taken a desired object of theirs. Apparently, donkeys were not considered very, very honorable animals to have. And for Moshe Rabbeinu to say, I never took a donkey, like, what, taking a donkey? You should have a camel, you should have a horse. So therefore, from chamor, they changed it to chemed, which means something desirable. Okay? And then you have the one that the Gemara says when it talks about the non-kosher animals, and one of the non-kosher animals that doesn't have both signs of chewing its cud and having split hooves, it's called an arnevis. What's an arnevis in English?
Rabbit.
They translate it as a rabbit, a hare, something like that, right? Well, the Gemara says they changed it to tzi'iras haraglayim, which means the thing that was short-legged, the short-legged creature, right? Rabbits are short-legged. But instead of saying arnevis, they said the short-legged creature. Why? So the Gemara says this. Mipnei she'ishtei shal Talmai arnevis shema. Talmai's wife's name was Arnevis. He shouldn't say, Sachaku bi'a Yehudim v'tilu shemishti b'Torah. The Jews are making fun of me, and they put my wife's name in the Torah, talk about a non-kosher animal. So these were some of the changes that they made. The miracle was the fact that all these changes were made by each one all together, even though none of them knew what the other one was doing. Okay, so now that's where the Gemara stops. The Gemara does not comment on this episode. Was it good? Was it bad? No comment in the Gemara about it. The comments come already from other sources. So, for instance, you've got the Masechah Seifrim. Masechah Seifrim it's like by Brisa. It wasn't included in the Mishnah, but it comes from the same sages of the Mishnah, of the Talmud. Then you have something called Megillas Tainus. Megillas Tainus is also from the time period of the second Beis HaMikdash. It's a record of the days that the sages instituted, we'll call them mini holidays that you don't fast on them. And then there are also holidays mentioned that we do fast. And one of the fasts that's mentioned, actually the fast that's mentioned in Tevis, there's 3 fasts mentioned. Ches Tevis, the 8th of Tevis, the 9th of Tevis, and the 10th of Tevis. And the 8th of Tevis, okay, the 10th of Tevis, we know what that is, right? That's the siege of Yerushalayim, that we fast. Then there's the 9th of Tevis. The 9th of Tevis has its own interesting discussion because the 9th of Tevis, anybody know what the 9th of Tevis commemorates?
I forgot.
It's the yard site of Ezra. Ezra HaSofer, the scribe, died on the 9th of Tevis. The thing is, though, that I'm not sure if it's here or somewhere else. If it's in the Maseches Taanis somewhere else, it says Yom Tes is a fast. We don't know why. We don't know why. The tradition is that it's Ezra. That is Ezra's yard site, but it doesn't say it straight out. Separate discussion. And the 8th is, says the Megillas Taanis, was when the sages translated the Torah into Greek. The Yarda Chayshach La'olam Gimel Yamim. And for 3 days, darkness came down to the earth. So Megillas Taanis, and actually the Maseches Sofrim calls it V'haya Hayom Kasha. It was as bad as the day that the Egel was worshipped. So there you got two sources that say this was not a good thing. It was not a good thing that the Torah was translated. Okay, so now the question is, okay, what was so bad? So I'm going to share with you 2 explanations that the Chassam Sofer gives. The Chassam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, the Rav of Pressburg, was a Rav also in Germany and Hungary, famous Chassam Sofer. So the Chassam Sofer gives 2 explanations as to what was so bad. And it's going to be very interesting because his 2 explanations are going to be explanations that really focus, well, his focus is on the fact they translated the Chumash, right? Okay. Anything wrong? Is there going to be a problem with translating anything other than Chumash? Is there going to be a problem? Let's cut to the chase a little bit, not to the chase, but to the, something wrong with the Art Scroll Gemara, right? Is something wrong with that, right? Is it only Chumash? Is it Gemara? How far is this problem? Can this problem go? And there are a lot of different reasons why there can be a problem. But I want to share with you 2 interesting explanations from the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer this is talked about in his drushes. That means in his sermons. And for some reason, I shouldn't say for some reason, but the 8th of Tevis, he has a number. The 8th of Tevis, he always gave a drasha. Drasha meant everybody stopped, everybody came to the shul, and he gave this sermon. And on the 8th of Tevis, he seemed to have done this an awful lot. And when he talks about one explanation that he gives to what was the problem is that there's a pasuk that reads like this in Devarim, beginning of Devarim, Perek Dalet pasuk Vav, Ushamartem v'asisem, you shall guard and you shall do the mitzvahs of the Torah, Ki hi chachmaschem uvinaschem l'nei ha'amim, for it is your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nation. V'amru, and they will say, Rak am chacham enovan hagoy hagadol hazeh, this nation is clearly a wise and understanding great nation. Okay, that means when you keep the Torah and you keep the mitzvahs, and the nations of the world are going to observe you doing this, you're going to be in their eyes very wise and understanding. What does that mean? How does that happen? So the Chassam Sofer says it happens like this. The Chassam Sofer says the Torah really is very shorthand. There's not a lot of elaboration in the Torah. I mean, there's a lot going on there, but there's not a lot of elaboration in the words. So, for instance, he says, the Torah says, HaChodesh hazeh lochem, right? Establishing the new moon, okay? In order to be able to truly do the mitzvah establishing the new moon, what do you have to know?
Astronomy.
Got to know astronomy, okay? Another example he gives, the Chassam Sofer, he says, if you want to be able to do that, you have to be able to know astronomy. He says, here's another one. This is an interesting one. The Torah talks about kishuf, sorcery. Now the Rambam says that kind of stuff is not for real. Most commentaries say it is for real. Now, for the Torah to talk about sorcery and the different types of sorcery, that means you have to have a knowledge of it. How are you going to talk about it if you don't have a knowledge of it? He says another thing, the songs of the Levium. The Levium sang songs in the Beis HaMikdash, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he says, you got to know Chochmas HaMuzika. Yeah. You got to know music to be able to do that. Yeah. And he has, you talk about, and clearly he's talking about not only Torah Shebachsav, the written law, he's talking about Torah Sheba'al Peh, also oral law, and on Shabbos, one of the malachas one of the 39 malachas is oreg, weaving. Right? You know how hard it is when you have to learn the Gemara about weaving, the Mishnah is about weaving, to have any idea what it's talking about there? But if they're going to talk about this, right, and they talk about this malach, that means they had to know weaving. If you look through so many of the mitzvahs of the Torah, in order to be wise enough to really understand it, right, you need to know the background. You need to know how it works. And all these things really take a lot of study. Okay, so the Chassam Sofer says, so when did they study these things? That's the question he poses. When did they study these things? So we assume, well, it must have been that they must have taken out some time, and they went to a weaver, and they went to a farmer, and they went to a sorcerer, and they went to an astronomer, which would mean that for sure in the times of the Mishnah, to do that, the kind of people who knew this were the Greeks, right? Aristotle, which again, Greek philosophy is not just philosophy, it's science, it's a lot of things, like the study of nature, there's a lot of things there. So it would seem that, that means they had to go study these other works in order to be able to know these things. Says the Chassam Sofer, no, they didn't. They did not. And he has different sources about, looking into about what the Gemara says about studying other subjects. Again, we're not talking about for Parnasa here. We're talking about for those who are studying Torah. And he says that the answer is, how they knew it? Because what does it say in Pirkei Avos, Richard? Hafayich ba, v'hafayich ba, dekula ba. Learn it over and over again because everything is in it. A person who really studies Torah as they're supposed to merit the understanding of everything in the world. They don't only understand just the Torah itself, they understand everything. Everything. And it all comes, the term used is Soid Hashem Lireyav, the secret of God to those who fear him. And if the person studies Torah the way our sages study Torah, and the way many others, there are stories of other sages who knew a lot of things from their Torah study. If you study Torah the way you really should, then even without studying these other things from outside sources, you have the knowledge of all these other wisdoms in order to be able to understand all the different parts of the world that the Torah encompasses. Okay? Says Chassam Sofer, you can only do that if you're studying the Torah in its original form. Once you have to go ahead and translate it into anything else, that doesn't happen. It has to be in its original form. It has to be in its holy form, its original form, and its form that has so many, as we mentioned, levels of understanding and depths. If you did it in the original form, that's where you get it. If it's not in the original form, you don't have it. And therefore, when the Torah says the nations of the world will see your wisdom in the Torah, he says the explanation is, they know that you haven't gone to study with them. You know you're not reading their books, and you still you still figure out all these things. How'd you do it? The answer is because you can get it from the Torah itself. Okay? And like he says, the problem is that that's going to be lost when it comes out that you translate a different language. So he says like this, Ach kol zeis beis ha-Torah kiksava uvekol shena. All this is only possible in the Torah is in its written form, in its language. But when you then translate the Torah into a different language, ein ze ki'im ha-muvan ha-pshitus leizulas. All you're going to get is what we call pshat. If you're translating it, you're getting pshat. You're getting the straightforward interpretation. And from that alone, it's not going to happen. Now, another thing he mentioned, I forgot to mention, is that, have you ever heard of Sefer Yosifun? Sefer Yosifun was written by a historian at the time of that period of Eretz Yisrael, of Yavan, of the Hanukkah story. He was there during that period of time, Yosifun. There's a Yosifun, there's a Josephus. Josephus, he lived later, I believe. He was with the Romans, I think. Maybe it was both, I don't know. But then there's Yosifun. Then there's this. There's Yosifun. And Yosifun says, he has it brought down, that when Talmai saw the translation, he was blown away by the Torah. Blown away by it. He thought it was unbelievable. And therefore, comes out the translation of the Torah brought a Kiddush Hashem, it brought a sanctifying, it brought honor to the Torah. So it's so bad. So he's saying, Tom, I was very impressed. If you just read the Torah, even pshat, even according to its straightforward explanation, it's going to be very impressive. But at the end of the day, it was very impressive. He says that, I don't know if he means at this time or whatever, but he says, once the Torah was translated into its simple form, he says, everybody ran after it. Everybody went for it. Those words, his Amsra Yehudim Kulam Lazev Limad Torah B'Lashon HaKodesh. They all abandoned learning Torah in Lashon HaKodesh. V'nitpesu Achrei Lashonos Acheres Latima Kipshuta, and they went after other languages to be able to bring it out in its straightforward form. He says it's something that spread. I mentioned that I remember hearing it. The people in Alexandria only eat the Septuagint to learn the Torah. But he's making it sound like this was a widespread thing, and it was a widespread thing that seemed to catch on to be able to study the Torah not only in Greek, but in other languages in order to be able just to have a simple interpretation, which means that the Jews lost out on this ability to delve into the Torah. And now, if you want to know how to do things on Shabbos, you want to know how to weave, how are you going to do it? Got to go on YouTube, right? You got to go somewhere else. You got to go to other sources. Which, again, especially in the times of the Mishnah, was a very dangerous endeavor, because there were a lot of other things that were caught up and involved in that too. But it's also, I think, the mere fact that now people were not studying the Torah in its original form, which he mentions all the wisdoms of the world that you can attain from it, which they were not going to have from it itself, which he says the problem with that is that you make the Torah look like it's missing. Instead of the Torah looking at something that encompasses everything, you're saying, no, it only takes one thing, and you got to go somewhere else for everything else. That's lowering the esteem of the Torah. And therefore, he said, that's a problem. Okay? And especially if everybody goes to do that, that lowers the esteem of the Torah. So that's one explanation of the fact that it was dark days, because now the fact that now they're not studying the Torah in its original language with everything that lies within it. He doesn't mention what we mentioned. He doesn't mention gematria. Doesn't mention all those other the Kabbalistic interpretation of the Torah. He doesn't mention those things. But you can apply it here too, of the idea of really minimizing what the Torah contains and what we can have from the Torah. Another explanation he gives, and it seems like it's similar but a little bit different, is the fact that he says there's so many places in the Torah, even to get pshat, even to get the straightforward explanation. You look in the Ramban, you look in the Rashbam, you look in the Sforno, you look at Rashi. You can have psukim that it's very hard even to interpret the Pashat pshat, the straightforward explanation. Okay, it's very hard to do that. Okay, so if somebody's studying Chumash, right, and you learn the Chumash, and the Torah's wording itself, right, all those different interpretations of the pshat are all because the Torah lends itself to that. The Torah lends itself to those many different interpretations. It lends itself to that. That's part of the depth of Torah. The fact that you could see it in many different ways. Okay, so if you want to know at the end of the day, let's say for a practical application, how do we understand it? How should we interpret it? How should we do it? What do you got to turn to? The sages. You got to turn to the sages, right? Yeah, meaning at an earlier point, you have to turn to Rashi, he's right, but even at an earlier point, at an earlier stage of the development of the understanding of Torah, right? You have these things, you're studying it, the Torah encompasses lots of different ways of looking at things. At the end of the day, when you need to know what are we going to follow, which interpretation do we follow, what understanding do we follow, who you got to turn to? You got to turn to the sages. You got to turn to Torah Shabbal Peh. You got to turn to the Oral Law. Okay, but now what happens, says the Chassam Sofer, that if now you take the Torah, right, you put it into Greek, right, and now in Greek you're not going to have that problem. You're translating the Torah in Greek, you're not going to have this question, oh, does it mean this? Does it mean that? Because the other languages don't encompass that kind of depth to be able to see the different types of interpretation in it. And therefore, you look at the Greek, the Greek says this, right? The translation says this, and that's it. I got it. I don't need to turn to the sages. I don't need to turn to the commentaries. I don't need to turn to nothing. I have it. And that's a problem, because that really leads to problems. When people think that they have the interpretation of the Torah and they don't need the sages to interpret, they don't need the Torah Shabbal Peh to interpret, the oral law to interpret, the interpretation of the wise to interpret it, that's how all the Bible critics and all the other people do their thing. They take what it says with their translation and they say, this is what it says, and they build up things off of it. So therefore, it comes out according to this other interpretation that the problem is that when it is in Greek or in any other kind of translation, you now basically give it some kind of a definitive form, which people think, oh, we got the definitive interpretation, and they don't look anymore to be able to understand other interpretations, other levels, other ways of seeing it, and turning to those who have the tradition to tell you how to interpret, understand it, and follow it. Okay, so basically, it means this lent itself to a situation of people not listening to the sages, not following the sages, taking the Torah as is and thinking they have the explanation and running with it. Instead of turning to and if you study in the Lashon Kodesh, in the holy language, you know there's lots of depth and lots of ways of looking at it. You know there needs to be a way of interpreting it, because sometimes we can't interpret it on our own. And for that, we have to look towards the sages, to the oral law, to our sages. Once the Torah was given a form, that was the beginning of when people decided we don't need the sages, we can just take it as it is and run with it. And if you think about it, that could be a danger in looking at it in a general way, that when the Torah or anything of the Torah is interpreted in a different language, right? The wrong people get a hold of it. There's a problem. They use it. They use it for their things, right? Yeah. How many people online, right, decide to take a line out of the Talmud, right, which they got because they found some kind of translation, or there's more complicated stories with that. But they have these things. They take a look. They grab something. Somebody tells them something. Oh, look what it says. And there are things that we do know that are a little touchy, right? They're a little touchy. If they're fall into the wrong hands, it could become a problem. So even if you want to talk about the depth of the written law, but there is depth to the oral law too. And when you go ahead and just go ahead and translate it into English, and the people the wrong people get their hands on it, they misinterpret it. It's a problem. So therefore, you have a lot of discussion. There were many rabbis that were really against translating anything. They're against translating anything. The Tzitz Eliezer, I mentioned him many times before. Tzitz Eliezer talks about, there's the book of Daniel in Tanakh, right? Is a book that's written in what language? Aramaic. It's written in Aramaic. Okay. Somebody wanted to make a Hebrew translation of it. Wanted to write a Hebrew translation of Daniel. Or he talks about, there was another thing. I'm sure, are you familiar with Ein Yaakov? Yeah. Ein Yaakov is a compilation of the Agadic Gemaras, right? Put together to actually teach people in between Mincha and Ma'ariv, to teach them, to inspire them towards Yiras Shamayim, fear of God. Okay. Now, I never knew this, but it seems like I always thought that literally they took the Gemaras word for word and put it in. And it seems like, no, some of them were a little bit, shortened. A little bit. Once it's not everything word for word, but it's clearly the crux of it. But now again, Agadic Gemara is hard to understand. Somebody wanted to, this is years back, somebody wanted to write I think it was a German or a Yiddish translation. I think it was a Yiddish translation. A Yiddish translation of Ein Yaakov. What's so bad? What's so bad? But the answer is that if you know the truth about Agadic Gemaras, right? The ones that's so hard to understand, or the ones that seem so simple, they're far from simple. They're actually considered, in essence, the most difficult to understand, because they're all written in a certain way, like a metaphor. Yeah. And even if it's a true story, it still is there more, could sometimes be there for the metaphor, as a metaphor to understand something much deeper. And there is a source that says that, even if now we cannot understand Agadic Gemaras in our physical bodies, right? Eventually, when we are pure, we'll get to understand them. Mm-hmm. But that only happens, according to so many rabbis that many rabbis wrote, it only happens if you first study it in the Gemara wording. If you use the Gemara wording, and you talk about, meaning the Gemara was written by Amoraim, right? And there was lots and lots of depth even to that. So they say if you study in the original language, okay, then you can merit eventually to get the real understanding. But if you don't learn in the original language, which only has a very surface explanation, you're not going to get that. There were those against translating the davening. Like to daven, I guess there were people who wanted people to daven in a language they understood, to daven language they understood. And there are people who are very against that, because when our sages made davening, you know what lies in the words of davening? There's so much going on the words of davening. Even if you're saying it, we say that to daven in Hebrew is more important. Even if you don't understand, right? You should daven that. You say that language. Why? You should learn it too. But it's important to do it in that language. Why? Because in the language that Chazal made the prayers, there's so much depth in it. Mm-hmm. There are so many ideas. There's so many concepts. There's so many tikkunim, rectifications for the world and for Shemayim to bring down blessing. It all lies in those words. If you don't use those words, you don't have it. So there's lots of discussion. Okay, so what are we going to say, right? But we know that the Jewish people in many, many areas for many years have been translating the Chumash in Yiddish. They have a Yiddish translate. They have a Siddur translated in Yiddish, which wasn't meant to daven in Yiddish. It was meant to understand. Okay, but they have translations in Yiddish. There was, how can we not talk about the art scroll, right? How do we try to rectify, well, if by Talmud it was so dark, it was such a bad thing to do, how do we do it? But there's even a bigger question I keep forgetting to bring up, right? Who was the first translator of the Torah in a foreign language?
Moshe.
That's true too.
Yeah.
Who else? He's not the first, you're right, Moshe was. Onkelos.
Yeah.
Onkelos, right? We all study the Torah with Onkelos. Shnai Mikra Targum, Onkelos. He translated in Aramaic. How do you do that? So one answer is going to be, and again, we don't have time to elaborate on this, but just it's food for it's what to think about. Is if you think about it, just think about the art scroll shots. Think about it, right? Is it a translation? It's not just a translation; it's a commentary. It's a commentary. Mm-hmm. It wasn't in. They didn't write it just to be a translation. There's other translations which I'm not going to say right now, right? I'll say it. Sensino, right? Sensino was, it was a translation, right? Was a commentary too. I don't know. I never really went through it, but it's clearly not as clear. You don't really get the picture of things as much. Maybe you'll get a translation of a word, but you're not going to get the idea. Maybe you do. I shouldn't. I don't want to knock it. But I'm saying the idea of the art scroll was to do more than Sensino. It was to give more than just a translation. It was to give greater understanding. Forget about just the notes. Just looking at the top part with the notes and everything, it gives you tremendous understanding of what's going on, not just translation, understanding. The Targum that the sages did for Talmud was a translation. It was not commentary. It was not, or as we say, it was not elucidation. Mm-hmm. It was commentary. It was not elucidation. And the other translations at least saw themselves, right, as an elucidation, not just a translation. And once you start, at least, so now again, that's not going to help you for the reasons of the Chassam Sofer, seemingly. It's not going to help that. But if there's a question of, you're limiting yourself and you're only sticking to the pshat in a sense where that could lead to problems, well, once you're doing more than just translating, you're elucidating, then already you're able to give it a better understanding so that then the people who study it will be able to deal with it and work with it better and not use it at least in the wrong way and not use it in the wrong ways. One thing I want to conclude with, a nice little story. There is a Rav in Eretz Yisrael, his name is Rabbi Arbach, Shem Zalman Arbach's brother. Rabbi Arbach was in America, and then the 12-day war with Iran broke out, and he was stuck in Cyprus. Okay, he was stuck in Cyprus. Okay, so where do you think he hung out when he was in Cyprus for over a week? Where do you hang out? We're supposed to hang out in Cyprus. Where is a leading rabbi of Israel going to hang out in Cyprus?
Chabad.
In the Chabad house.
In the wheel?
In the Chabad house.
All right.
The Chabad house. Okay? Now, such a rabbi, what does he spend most of his time doing? He's studying Torah. Okay? So, Chabad house didn't have a lot of svarim. Or didn't have a lot of the svarim that he needs. And they had one shas. Guess which one it was?
Stein salts.
Nope. It was not. It was the Hebrew art scroll, as they refer to as the blue art scroll. This is the brown art scroll, and then there's the blue art scroll, which is everything the English has and more in Hebrew. You know, in Eretz Yisrael, right, people are walking around with the blue one. Okay? They're using the blue one. Okay? It was the first time he saw it. It was the first time he ever saw it. And he was blown away by it. That's what he used to study from. He loved it. And not only, and when the art scroll people heard about it, guess what they did?
They reissued it.
They brought him a full set. In Eretz Yisrael, they brought him a full set. And the story that I heard from Rabbi Yoel Pluchak was that his wife was like, "Where are we going to put this? They all live in small apartments. Where are we going to put this?" And he said, "For something important like this, we'll find a place." So, interesting way of ending our conversation. A lot to talk about, a lot to think about. And thank you all for listening and being here. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.